This was the engine that should have saved Alco. Instead, it destroyed their reputation. The 244 diesel was rushed to market, plagued with failures, and it crippled one of America's oldest locomotive builders. By the late 1940s, railroads were ready to leave steam behind and embrace the diesel age. Alco, a company once celebrated for building some of the most powerful steam locomotives in America, knew it had to make the leap. The 244 was supposed to be their ticket into the future, a brand new diesel prime mover that could finally put them on equal footing with EMD. But there was one problem: it wasn't ready. The engine was hurried through development, corners were cut, and the result was an unreliable machine that railroads quickly learned to mistrust. Crankshaft failures, overheating issues, and endless shop time turned what should have been Alco's redemption into a disaster. Instead of carrying Alco into the diesel era, the 244 became the anchor that dragged them down. And once trust was lost, it was nearly impossible to win back. When World War II ended, the American railroad industry stood at a crossroads. Steam had carried the nation through wartime, but by the mid-1940s, its days were numbered. Railroads were looking for something cleaner, more efficient, and cheaper to maintain. Diesel power wasn't a novelty anymore. It was the future. And one company had already seized that future with both hands: the electromotive division of General Motors. EMD's 567 series engine was rewriting the rules of railroading. Introduced in the late 1930s and refined throughout the war years, the 567 was rugged, easy to maintain, and most importantly, reliable. It powered the famous FT freight locomotives that had proven diesel could handle long-haul service. After the war, the floodgates opened. Railroads rushed to order EMD's new F units and GP series locomotives. Everywhere you looked, the 567 was winning trust mile by mile. For Alco, this was a crisis. The American Locomotive Company had built its reputation on iron and steam. They were masters of massive articulated locomotives, the kind that hauled coal over mountain passes and symbolized raw industrial might. But in the diesel world, they were behind. Their early diesel offerings, like the HH switchers, were respectable, but they weren't groundbreaking. Alco could no longer rely on past glory. It needed a modern prime mover that could compete directly with EMD's 567. That pressure led to the birth of the 244 engine. Alco's leadership knew they couldn't afford to spend a decade perfecting the design. Railroads were buying diesels by the hundreds, and every sale lost to EMD was another nail in the coffin. So Alco rolled the dice. They pushed their engineering teams to develop an all-new diesel prime mover as quickly as possible, one that would match or even surpass the 567. On paper, the 244 was impressive. It was a turbocharged four-stroke engine available in both 12-cylinder and 16-cylinder configurations. The four-stroke design gave it a distinct edge in theory: better efficiency, more complete combustion, and room for higher power out as technology advanced. The turbocharger promised even more muscle, ensuring the engine could deliver strong horsepower ratings without sacrificing fuel economy. In an era when railroads were looking for efficiency and performance, the 244 checked all the boxes. Alco's marketing team touted it as a game changer. They positioned the 244 as the engine that would close the gap with EMD and secure Alco's place in the diesel age. And truthfully, on paper, they weren't wrong. The 244 had all the right features. Compared to the naturally aspirated EMD 567, a turbocharged four-stroke sounded like the smarter, more advanced choice. Railroads were intrigued. Orders began to come in for new Alco models built around the 244. These included road locomotives like the PA passenger units and the FA freight haulers. With sleek styling and big horsepower numbers, Alco's offerings looked like they were ready to go toe-to-toe with anything EMD had on the market. For a brief moment, it seemed like Alco might have pulled it off, but beneath the polished sales pitches, the 244 was being asked to leap before it had learned to walk. Development cycles that normally stretched for years were compressed into months. Endurance testing was cut short. Prototype refinements were skipped, and the gamble was that whatever weaknesses existed could be corrected once the locomotives were already in service. That gamble gave Alco something that looked competitive on delivery day, but it was an engine still carrying unanswered questions. In the short term, horsepower ratings and modern styling masked the uncertainty. Railroad executives signed purchase orders, reassured by Alco's history as a trusted builder. Yet the truth was that the 244 had never been through the grueling paces prices that real-world service would demand. And in the railroad industry, that kind of shortcut rarely stays hidden for long. The 244 was Alco's all-or-nothing attempt to prove it belonged in the diesel age. Success would mean a revival of its reputation. Failure would come at a cost the company might never recover from. Unfortunately for Alco, the weaknesses waiting inside the 244 would not stay buried for very long. The debut of the 244 was supposed to signal Alco's triumphant comeback. Instead, it quickly became the source of mounting frustration for the very railroads Alco needed to impress. The flaws were not subtle. They surfaced early, they surfaced often, and each one chipped away at the fragile trust Alco was trying to build in the diesel market. One of the most critical failures centered on the crankshaft. This component bore the brunt of the engine's power, translating piston motion into rotational energy. In the 244, crankshafts were prone to breaking under stress. A single failure could take an entire locomotive out of service, often in a dramatic and costly fashion. For railroads, that meant trains delayed or even stranded, replacement power scrambled at the last minute, and expensive repairs piling up. But crankshafts weren't the only issue. Cooling quickly emerged as another chronic problem. Turbocharged engines generate a tremendous amount of heat. The 244 cooling system simply wasn't up to the task. Overheating became a persistent complaint, especially under heavy loads or in challenging environments like mountainous territory. Overheated engines failed outright, sometimes seizing so badly that major rebuilds were the only solution. Oil control compounded the misery. The 244 became notorious for leaks that stained shop floors and drained maintenance budgets. Seals and gaskets failed at an alarming rate, and in some cases, lubrication was inadequate where it mattered most. Oil starvation meant accelerated wear on bearings and moving parts, further increasing the risk of catastrophic breakdowns. For crews tasked with keeping locomotives in service, the 244 was more of a burden than a breakthrough. Adding insult to injury, these failures weren't occasional nuisances. They were widespread and relentless. Locomotives powered by the 244 developed reputations as shop queens, spending more time under repair than on the main line. A passenger engine stranded mid-run, a freight consist losing power halfway through a haul. These were not rare events. They were common enough that railroads began to view every 244-powered unit with suspicion. And reliability is everything in railroading. Delays not only inconvenience passengers or shippers, they disrupt entire networks. A single failure can ripple across hundreds of miles of track, affecting schedules, crews, and customer confidence. Railroads don't gamble on engines that can't be trusted, and the 244 was proving week after week that trust was misplaced. Even as Alco scrambled to identify fixes, the damage was being done in real time. EMD's 567 kept running with predictable dependability, while Alco's units limped from one shop visit to the next. Some railroads tried to mitigate the risks by assigning 244 locomotives to lighter or secondary duties, but the message was clear. These engines could not be relied upon for the heavy lifting of mainline service. The most dangerous consequence wasn't the breakdowns themselves, it was the loss of confidence. Once railroad management began to doubt a supplier, every new proposal from that company carried the baggage of past failures. Alco was facing a reputation crisis. Each crankshaft failure, each overheated unit, each oil-soaked shop visit eroded credibility in a market where credibility was everything. In the end, the 244's problems weren't confined to the shop floor. They spilled into boardrooms, financial ledgers, and long-term purchasing strategies. Railroads that might have been loyal customers began to drift toward EMD, not because they wanted the flashiest technology, but because they wanted engines that worked. And as those purchasing decisions piled up, Alco's big bet on the 244 looked less like bold innovation and more like a costly miscalculation. The 244 gave Alco a mechanical headache. It delivered such a harsh blow to the company's reputation that it never truly recovered from. In the railroad world, reliability is the difference between profit and disaster. When locomotives fail, freight doesn't move, schedules collapse, and costs skyrocket. So, when Alco's 244 engine began showing cracks almost immediately in real-world service, railroads took notice, and they didn't forget. By the early 1950s, Electromotive Division had already created a strong foundation with its 567 engine. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it worked consistently. Railroads that chose EMD knew they were buying locomotives that could run around the clock with spare parts available, and mechanics who understood the systems inside and out. Alco, meanwhile, was offering a gamble. On paper, the 244 promised modern engineering, impressive specifications, and more power than some EMD models. But once the locomotives hit the rails, shop crews and engineers quickly learned what the brochures didn't say. Oil leaks appeared in brand new units. Cooling systems overheated under heavy loads. Crankshafts failed, sometimes catastrophically, sidelining locomotives for weeks at a time. Every breakdown meant lost revenue, and for railroads already wary of change, Alco's missteps were proof that trying something new carried too much risk. The real tragedy for Alco wasn't that the 244 failed, it was that the failure came at the very moment when American railroads were transitioning wholesale from steam to diesel. This was Alco's once-in-a-century chance to cement itself as a leader in the new era. Instead, the company stumbled out of the gate while EMD delivered flawless performance. Every failed 244 meant another customer lost, another order canceled, and another fleet that went straight to EMD instead. What made things worse was how EMD leveraged the situation. The company had built an entire ecosystem around keeping them that way. EMD standardized parts across models, so repairs were straightforward. They deployed service reps to railroad shops, ensuring that any issue could be diagnosed and resolved quickly. If a railroad bought an EMD locomotive, they were buying into a support network that guaranteed uptime. Alco simply didn't have the same infrastructure. Their locomotives might get fixed eventually, but railroads couldn't afford to wait for eventually. And in a business as conservative as railroading, word of mouth was as powerful as any marketing campaign. When one major railroad experienced chronic breakdowns with the 244, the story spread quickly across the industry. Purchasing departments at other roads heard the complaints, and suddenly, Alco was viewed as a liability. Even if the company managed to patch certain problems, the stigma stuck. A single road failure could sour an entire region against Alco, and unfortunately, the 244 produced far more than a single failure. This reputation problem proved nearly impossible to shake. By the mid-1950s, Alco had already introduced improvements and attempted fixes, but by then, the damage was baked in. Railroads began to look at every new Alco product with suspicion. No one wanted to be the next guinea pig. Even loyal customers who had historically trusted Alco began hedging their bets by ordering more EMD locomotives alongside whatever Alco models they purchased. Slowly but surely, the balance of power tilted entirely toward EMD. The 244 had derailed Alco's credibility at a time when railroads were making massive long-term investments in diesel fleets. Once EMD had captured that trust, those relationships endured for decades. Alco, despite continuing to build locomotives and even introducing better engines later, could never claw back the trust they had squandered. In the end, the 244 was more than just a troubled product. It became the turning point that shifted the industry's balance of confidence. Railroads began to avoid Alco entirely. And while EMD marched forward with dominance and steady growth, Alco found itself fighting not only mechanical battles, but also the ghosts of its past mistakes. The shadow of the 244 hung over everything the company produced afterward, a constant reminder to buyers that reliability was never guaranteed. For Alco, the fallout was devastating. What should have been their big leap into the diesel age became the start of a long decline. Their place in the market shrank, their once proud reputation was reduced to a cautionary whisper, and their competitors solidified their control of the industry. All because one engine, released before it was truly ready, betrayed the very thing railroads value above all else: trust. The 244's story didn't end when Alco moved on. In fact, its shadow stretched over everything the company did afterward. Alco eventually replaced the troubled engine with the 251, a far more reliable design. On paper, the 251 could compete with EMD's offerings. In practice, though, the 244 had already poisoned the well. Railroads simply didn't forgive. When millions of dollars were tied up in a locomotive fleet, no purchasing agent wanted to explain why they were giving another chance to the company that left them stranded trackside. And so, the 244 became more than just a mechanical failure. It became a cautionary tale. For Alco, it meant their reputation never fully recovered. For the rest of the industry, it reinforced a hard truth. You can't rush innovation without paying a price. Ironically, many rail fans look back on Alco locomotives fondly today. Their distinctive styling, their unique exhaust notes, and their historical significance give them a certain charm. But among the people who made decisions in the 1950s, charm didn't move freight. Reliability did. And on that measure, the 244 wrote Alco's obituary years before the company officially bowed out of the locomotive market. In the end, the lesson was unmistakable. In railroading, reliability is everything. The 244 arrived with high expectations, but those hopes collapsed under the weight of constant breakdowns and frustration. What Alco meant as a bold step into the diesel era instead became the very machine that weakened its standing with the railroads. Trust eroded, confidence disappeared, and by the time fixes were offered, the industry had already shifted its loyalty elsewhere. The 244 didn't mark a rough patch. It marked the point where Alco's reputation slipped beyond repair.